Do you remember the occasion when you first felt consciousness of your own individual self?
That was in my 11th year. There I suddenly, on my way to school, I stepped out of a mist. It was just as if I had been in a mist, walking in a mist, and I stepped out of it and I knew I am. I am what I am. And then I thought, but what have I been before? And then I found that I had been in a mist.
The point of life, the place where it's at, is simply here and now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about and other things.
Curious, why do you think people are fearful of the occult? And then we can get into what is actual magic really, the positive and negative pole. What's the good stuff versus the ego-based, self-serving, black magic stuff, all that?
Oh, great question. This is actually something I'm really passionate about as well, so I'm very happy that you brought that up. Occult, occulto, or occultus means hidden. And things like, for instance, if somebody is hiding and they jump out at you, you have a tendency to be scared. A lot of people just have a natural fear of the dark. They're scared of being alone in the dark, or scared of going upstairs. There's lots of different phobias based on what is unknown to the human mind, what could be there. So when things are occult, the natural tendency for a lot of people is to say, it's not directly exposed and 100% known to me, and therefore it's scary, or therefore it's to be shunned and shied away from. That being said, those who are willing to sit inside of the darkness for any length of time end up realizing that they find themselves at a much greater rate and a much greater capacity than if they're just sitting inside of the light or interacting with everything as they know it to be. It trains the senses to be able to feel and to sense things that you can't necessarily see with your eyes. It trains you to be aware of things that may have a much more subtle vibration. And in fact, I've studied with Merpati Putih here in the United States, which is an Indonesian martial arts form developed, 14 generations ago, or maybe 15 now, by the royal family in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And that whole system, they still train their Kopassus, which are like their Marines of Indonesia, in what is called vibra vision, or that's the way that we would call it in the United States. Vibra from vibration, vision obviously from seeing. And what you do is you use non-visual cortex, or cortices actually, of the brain in order to be able to perceive visual phenomena. And so they can actually see people under landslides, mudslides, etc., using these non-visual cortices that they've trained to pick up on visual phenomena, or visual sensory aspects. And they can also see in the dark much better than trained troops from around the world with night vision goggles and things like this. And so they teach vibra-vision here. The only place to learn it, I think, in the entire world outside of Jakarta, if you've been actually accepted in Balik 3 or higher ranks of Merpati Putih, which is a form of Pencak Silat martial art, is right here in Ogden, Utah. And you can't learn it anywhere else. So it's very unique, and I've seen multiple demonstrations and even interacted with the meditations in order to be able to do this and develop the non-visual, the visual sensory applications of non-visual cortices of the brain. And all I can say about that is that this is a key principle to understanding what the occult is. And just because something exists in the dark does not mean that it's bad or scary or demonic in any way, but it can also mean that it is. And traditionally, within the scope of occult sciences, you have this binary coding in the causal plane of things that exist just like you do within the physical plane. In the physical plane, with things that you can see, you have people that you might denote as evil or ignorant, or any of these other aspects, self-serving, so on and so forth. And then you have people that are, on the opposite end of that, which would be, the forces of good or enlightenment or, what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of self-serving, philanthropic, I guess, for lack of a better term. So all of these aspects exist also within the occult. There are things that are what we would refer to as qliphothic, which are more what we would refer to as demons or forces of destruction. And then there are also the forces that are typically referred to as angelic. And there's an entire spectrum in between those as well. And being able to interact and understand what each of those different forms of subtle energy is and what their place is absolutely critical to the practice of magic, because not all demonic or destructive forces are actually a bad thing, but placed in the wrong area or the wrong context, they can be very harmful. Put in the right context, then it's absolutely fantastic. If you've ever had a bad relationship that you need to get the hell out of, the forces of destruction or moving out of a particular negative viewpoint is absolutely critical. You have to put an end to something in order for something else to have space to open up. And so the forces of destruction and construction, which we'd call qliphothic and angelic, really need to always maintain a clear balance and be in their proper locations in order for the entire world of what we would refer to as occult sciences to work properly. There are always going to be people who have sinister or very personal intentions that they want to use their will and browbeat their will upon the universe, where they put those things out of context because they're not using natural flow or understanding their natural context, but instead using their will to be able to summon various forces like this in order to push forward their own agenda. And to me, that's very egotistical and very unethical and irresponsible of many individuals, but everybody's got their own path. A key example of that, in my opinion, would be Aleister Crowley and the entire body of Thelemic magic. Okay, not all Thelemic magic is negative or harmful or anything, but it is very much so about enacting your will, and doing so, enacting your will without necessarily having any sort of awareness about how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and is this within the context of natural law? So that's a big thing. And you find magicians doing things within the occult realm sometimes that are very questionable and very dark. And in Veda, you have the entire path of left-hand tantra, which is all about that, and not my cup of tea in any way, shape, or form. You also have various branches of what would be referred to as demonic Satanism, also not my cup of tea, not into that really at all. Although philosophically, I understand what I'm up against in working with people like that, because they oftentimes, in their ignorance of just utilizing their will, open up really negative portals of destruction and of maleficence that should not necessarily be in those locations or areas. And so it's important to be able to know what you're up against and how to be able to close that portal, how to be able to put that qliphothic force back into its proper context, back into its place, because a lot of times they summon and don't close. And that to me is just irresponsible, unethical, and based in people trying to push their own will and do stupid shit. It's the same type of destruction in the seen world, in the physical world, where people have good intentions but end up doing stupid shit, pardon my French. Happens all the time. In fact, that might even be the majority of the narrative of the human epic. So with that being said, there's also the other end, which is very what we would refer to as angelic. Okay, so the whole concept of Enochian calls and Enochian magic, also the forms of Kabbalah, at least the Judaic forms of Kabbalah, typically deal specifically with the more angelic side of things. And Goetia works with an entire scope of things. It could be angelic, it could be qliphothic. So there's things like that. And then outside of that, within the realm of just magical practice in general, or the occult, there's entire scopes between those two polarities. And what I and Paracelsus and many others have really sought to work with and achieve is what we would refer to as natural magic. And natural magic deals with the principles of nature as she presents herself to us, and working within the forces of nature to be able to put our will in with the will of what is already happening within the causal plane of nature, to be able to manifest something for the greater good and also for our own personal benefit as well. And so it becomes a very empowering path of being able to get the things that you want, or put your energy into the things that you want by working with natural cycles and natural things. So like, for instance, if you're trying to get rid of something, doing that at a time where fall is present, or when a particular planet, say, is going retrograde, where it's falling away from the pack of the rest of the planets moving, then that could be a very potent way of interacting with things that utilizes natural magic. And really, it's all based in intention, it's based in focus, and it's based in some sort of sensationalization and ritual. So things are not really so difficult if you break them down simply in the occult sciences. They just have various principles that they abide by, which is that you can summon absolutely any sort of entity if you're into that. There are multiple different ways of doing that, like, for instance, Brazilian art of Quimbandeira, the Irish and Celtic methods, like Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Celtic methods of working with the She or the Fae. Working in South America with beings or entities like Chuyachaki and multiple different other entities like bioregional animism concepts. All of those are actual entities, the way that they are perceived, and you always have something they want, which is human expression, and they have something that you want. Perhaps an intelligence, perhaps an answer, perhaps the ability to influence things in a particular way that you find desirable, and so on and so forth. And so there are ways of interacting with multitudes of different entities. Depending on the entity, every different method is going to be different, but it's ultimately based in intention and some sort of ritual, and then the ability to sensationalize or bring that forth with a sense of confidence. And of course, there is potential for abuse or unethical use, and there's also the potential for completely ethical use and ways of utilizing these things that are not out of balance, and certainly not in any way, shape, or form considered to be or should be considered demonic in any way, shape, or form. But they have been typically considered demonic because the Christian church, starting with the Catholic Church, really began to demonize any other god or animism, sense of animism besides the one God very long ago. And that stems all the way back to the Pharisees in Hebrew times as well. And so you just see this continuation of monotheistic Pharisee way of looking at things that has extended into Judeo-Christian culture as well as Judeo-Muslim culture today. So, but they're all Abrahamic. So that's where that originates from.
You think Jesus was a magician?
I'm not even sure that Jesus was an actual individual, to be perfectly honest. From all of the archaeological and anthropological evidence, there's absolutely nothing conclusive that leads me to believe that Jesus was an individual. But the archetype of Jesus is rad, and if the archetype of Jesus existed as it's written about in the scriptures, you explain to me how else he turned water into wine, or why else he would have turned water into wine, or, created loaves and fishes and other things like that. That to me sounds very magical.
So I'm a Christian, but I'm very different from, your typical, when people hold signs, gays are going to hell, and that's just not the way it's supposed to be. And for me, it's something that's personal between me and God. It's not for me to tell other people, what they should believe. And I respect other people's beliefs. I respect other people's religions. And I look at the person as, an individual and what they do. And I think you hit the nail on the head that it's human nature for people to misuse, a belief system, or to kind of bend it to what they want for their own will.
Right.
And it's so interesting because when you study various religious texts or spiritual texts, and I do, because to me, you can't understand what it is you believe without looking, and there's a lot of Christians who would say, oh, you shouldn't do that. But I'm sorry, I don't think that there's anything wrong with knowledge.
Yeah.
I think it helps us really understand and make sense of what it is that we believe. And if it holds muster, it shouldn't scare us to look at other things.
Precisely. Yeah.
Right. And so it's interesting because, you know, when you look at different ways that people intake this information, there's some people who I don't think they really understand where that belief comes from. You know, they are raised that way and they kind of go, okay, well, this is what it is. They never question it. When I was 19, tried to prove that God didn't exist. I kind of went the opposite way. And I came from a really strong family that was, you know, really strong Christian. But I needed to go through that because in doing that, I circled back around to believing what I did in a much more substantial way, but in a much more personal relationship. Yeah. So I think you find that in all fields where people tend to take it and try to use it as a weapon. You know, you hear people claiming, well, God's on our side. And you're going, how do you really know? Because it's something that, you know, when you reflect, whether it's prayer or meditation, you know, your connection with that spiritual world, it is something that is very personal. And even, you know, when I read the Bible, each time I read it, I get something different. And I think that's how it's meant to be for me. I'm not saying for anyone else, but it's supposed to be something for me where when I read it, I'm getting something different, maybe from, you know, another person who might read the same thing. So I do find it hard when, you know, certain people of certain faiths say, well, this is absolutely what it means. I'm going, well, maybe not. Maybe there's a little bit more to it. So, but anyways, I had to chime in a little bit because, you know, I don't want to say that that's not what I believe, but I love hearing and I respect all the concepts that you were talking about because it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that we can get a lot from each, you know, different field. So
that's really cool. Thank you for chiming in. Yeah. And, you know, like a large part of my own experience is actually informed by Christianity as well. I mean, I wasn't my mom, when I was a child, always used to say, even though she was very non-denominational, she'd always say, Jesus loves you and so do I. That was the way I went to bed every single night as a child. And when I was 8, I decided that I wanted to be Catholic, actually. I could go into talking about why I wanted to do that for ages, actually, but realistically, there were a lot of aspects of ritual and possibly even what I would conceive of today as like past life karma and other things that I still needed to work out in order to get to where I am. But I also, you know, found through that and learning all about the entirety of Christian history and church history, and then also, like yourself, like finding what other religions believe, even within the scope of what is considered Christian. Like, what do the Coptic churches believe? What do the Gnostic churches believe? What did the Huguenots of France believe? And what did Calvin believe? And what did, all of these other individuals that ultimately split off, you know, why did King Henry split off and create, you know, the Church of England and so on and so forth? What were the major tenets between all of those? And learning about all the differences in Christianity, I think, was one of those nuances that actually strengthened my ability to believe in what I believed in at the time, and to be able to say, you know, now I have a greater understanding of where everybody else is at. That actually brought a greater understanding to where I was at as well, and you know, what camp I was in. Although, you know, from the very beginning, I still had this form where I was studying Druidry and the lessons of modern day Druidry at the same time that I consider myself a closet Druid at that time, where I very much so within the catalog of Catholic saints, utilizing them in magical practices where otherwise I would have just used a more polytheistic kind of catalog of like my ancient Irish or Nordic gods and so on and so forth. And eventually, you know, the whole sway for Christianity for me was, of course, there is a universal source. And sure, I can call that God. I could also call that Allah. I could call that absolutely anything that I want. I could call it Yahweh. I could, you know, also call that Brahman. I could call that Vishnu. And for years, I actually was very deep inside of the Hindu faith and learned to categorize not only their theistic system within what was already familiar to me within the catalog of saints of the Catholic tradition, but also within their supreme Godhead of Vishnu or Krishna or Shiva, depending on which type of Hinduism you really subscribe to, as being a godhead of the universe, and seeing that holographic and fractal aspect, regardless of what you call it, regardless of how you conceive it, being so present in everything that for me, nothing became evil or nothing became demonic. It just lended a much more thorough way of looking at things where it didn't have to be scary, where I already had a context for it and already had a way of realizing that we're really debating semantics at a certain point, or at least that was my takeaway. And again, like you, I want to be very certain that, just even though I always speak from a place of certainty from what I know, that's not to tell other people what they should know. Experience informs reality, and I want everybody to have their own experience. I'm just trying to share mine.
Yeah, and I love that. I studied in England for about 8 months, and my favorite conversations I've ever had in my life were, I had roommates from India and I had a roommate from Estonia. So he always had stories about, because he grew up in Russia for I think 10 years, but we got into these great religious discussions. It was so amazing because we stayed up one night until 7 a.m. and no drugs or anything.
Exactly.
It was so amazing because I think that so many people forget to open up and exchange ideas and experiences, and there's so much learning that can be done there, because walking away from those conversations, those were lifelong friends. And it was so amazing because my roommate from India, he said, I've never had someone that I've met who was Christian who was as open, and and it made me feel good. I'm going, well, that's great, because I'm curious and I want to learn and I want to know. And it's just so, to me, life is beautiful. And I believe that every person, and this may be a little bit naive, but I think that every person innately has a lot of good. Even people who are what some people would call evil, I feel like there's something that's happened in their past that has scarred them and it's hurt them, and it comes out in different ways. And until they resolve that in and of themselves, it's very hard to see the peaceful side of it. So yeah,
You and I are on the exact same page with that, exact same page. I always like to say, concerning people that are conceived to be evil, that the road to hell was always paved with good intentions.
Right. It's just how you take that road, right? And where you end up with it.
Exactly.
So you mentioned John Dee in relation to Enochian magic. And was John Dee, he was the court magician of, was it Queen Elizabeth?
Yes. And also the Alchemist, him and Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly was kind of like his confidant, his partner that he practiced a lot of this work with. And he was very, very central in Renaissance England to, tons of different positions. Some say he was even a spy and so on and so forth. But he was definitely an alchemist and a hermeticist and a Kabbalist and, so on and so forth.
Now, I haven't done a lot of research into that, but do you think, or do you know or have any details, was that a common thing for a queen or a king to have a court magician?
By that period, it was starting to really become more taboo, actually. But up until that period, yes. In fact, if you didn't, then you couldn't know when to go to war or why to go to war, or who you could actually trust, or any of these other things, because typically the court magician, for lack of a better term, we'll use the term magician, they would be able to perform things like dowsing, and they would be able to perform, astrological readings and find out when natural forces were already moving in conjunction with your own country's desires to be fortuitous or not fortuitous for you. And you find that everywhere. We find that in Africa. We find that in the Indian subcontinent. We find that through mainland Asia and through the Middle East. We find that in Europe. Every single ruler from basically the beginning of time that we've recorded has all had something like a court magician to be able to inform their experiences. And like in the Irish catalog, we have Brehon La, which was created by the Druids of Ireland in order to be able to not only guide kings, but to be able to create, because they had what was known as an Ardri, a high king, but then they also had different lower kings that were under the Ardri that would look over the various kingdoms for them. And all of those were all informed by the Druids. And so with a single word of a Druid, two different warring factions would actually be able to come together and see peace or see sense based on the things, or be advised to go to war because that was in the greater good of things. Multiple different things like that have always existed, whether we're talking about prehistoric or pre-Christian Europe, or we're talking about more contemporaneous times. But starting around the time of Queen Elizabeth, it became very taboo. And so the fact that she was utilizing, Edward Kelly and Dr. John Dee to be able to do these things, and that it became so well known, was kind of one of those like, whoa, are you sure you know what you're doing kind of thing. And people still use them today. Like even presidents have their own astronomers and spiritual advisors and things like that who provide that same type of advice and same role today.
Yeah. Trump's got a very interesting spiritual advisor. I'll leave it at that.
That guy's just got a lot of interesting everything. He breaks the mold, man. He breaks the mold.
So yeah, I'm personally kind of obsessed with like sifting through archives of ancient esoteric and occult texts or manuscripts and just seeing what's out there. And so I've inevitably come across like tons of like grimoires. And when I first ran into them, I was pretty shocked at like the vast amount of them that are out there. Yeah. And it really kind of goes to show that the magical arts are and have been throughout history taken very seriously. Yeah. The books, in and of themselves are often beautiful works of art. And I think the general population really has no idea. So let's talk a little bit about that. What constitutes a grimoire?
Well, I mean, technically a grimoire, or sometimes referred to as a book of shadows, again, drawing on more occult kind of concept, is really just a collection of spell work or a collection of rituals that has popped up from any particular tradition or any particular magician, so to speak. And so, a grimoire could be, just the notes of somebody who was like, hey, if I do this and I do this and I do this with this color candle and this thing, hold this intention, do the ritual this way, what happens? And it could also be something like, my great grand passed on to me these things that we do in order to get in touch with this thing. And now I'm finally writing them down because they've just been an oral tradition for, a long time. And so, the scope of what can show up within grimoire traditions in the Western magical, how would I even refer to that category, I suppose, can be very, very diverse. And it's literally as diverse as the authors who pen them. And like you said, a lot of them have really illustrious magic and imagery that goes along with it, including, the drawings and all of the emblems and woodcut, wood blocks and all of the other things that can associate them. And some of them are just very simple, written and penned in plain wordage in whatever language that they have, and taking a look at those things. But traditionally, yeah, it's kind of, grimoires tend to be more folk magic style, originating very heavily and drawing very heavily from the traditions that they inherited or traditions that are culturally very relevant to them. And that's the way that we look at them today too, from an anthropological angle, when we're studying magic of various cultures, is what written records do we have? And these grimoires are usually the things that inform us the most about what various magical traditions could have been prevalent in that area at that time, and how many people could have been practicing, and so on and so forth. Grimoires are typically not done by way of like covens or groups of witches, wizards, warlocks, etc., but more individual practitioners that provided us a glimpse into their own personal insights. So it's difficult to say what could have been prevalent amongst more individual practitioners, but still, that's pretty much what gives us an idea, because groups of witches were very much so condemned throughout most of the history where the remaining grimoires still exist. So they were things that you had to practice primarily as a solitary practitioner, because if you were to do these things in large groups, or to admit that you were doing them in large groups, it could have resulted in a great deal of legal persecution.
Yeah, for whatever reason, like occult orders and secret societies have always been an interest of mine, and I used to be very weary about like Freemasons and stuff, you know, always intrigued with the mystery though. But when you look into it, it's a pretty vast history, and yes, there were corrupt individuals within Freemasonry, and probably still are to a degree. Although I know, you know, most people think, and I think you were actually a member of the OTO at one point. So right. I think it's kind of cool to talk to you, and I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on all that, like within the different secret societies. And, you know, it's for the average person looking from the outside, looking in, the mystery of it, it could be a lot of assumptions and confusions, and there's so many different orders and all of this stuff, and maybe you can kind of like clarify a little bit, or kind of give an insight into that world to a certain degree.
Sure, yeah. So within the realm of esoteric orders, there's like a wide spectrum of them. I mean, most people have heard of Freemasons, but they don't even recognize that there's a difference between York Rite, Scottish Rite, Free and Accepted, Freemason. There's lots of different types of subdivisions. And within those, you even have like, you know, the Order of the Crescent Moon, or you have like the Shriners, you have, you know, so many different sub-organizations as well, based on level, rank, degree, and people who have common interests within those organizations, creating sub-organizations that have presence within the temple. You also see within the Rosicrucian orders, which were, Rosicrucian really derives so much of its history, mythology, way of approaching things from a mystical Christian perspective, acknowledging that most of the mysteries that Jesus was trained in, according to them, came from Egypt and the Egyptian mystery schools. So we lose, you know, a huge, vast time of Jesus's life from the time that he's just, you know, like 12 or 13 until the point where he's 30. So we have like 20 years of missing history, archaeologically speaking and historically speaking, on him. And a lot of people have hypothesized that, you know, because Mary and Joseph moved to Egypt at one point, that he would have been initiated into the Egyptian mystery schools and all of these other things. There's entire books about all of this concept. There's a lot of Gnostic texts and Gnostic Gospels about this as well. And so there is some evidence of all of this, but this is largely the information the Rosicrucians kind of inform themselves with. And even within the Rosicrucian orders, there's a lot of different ways of practicing the true and invisible order of the Rosicrucis, or of the Rosicrucians. You have AMORC in the United States, which is Ancient Mystical Order, Rosicrucis. You have KORC in France, the Kabbalistic Order of the Rosicross. You have many different German factions, because Christian Rosenkreuz was a German individual, or said to be a German individual, again, more than likely from an anthropological and archaeological perspective, historical perspective. This was a more of a made-up individual, and more of a body of people who thought along the same ways of like a more mystical Christianity. But yeah, there's lots of different factions, and essentially, and then, you know, later with Aleister Crowley and Mathers, MacGregor Mathers, they really differed at odds, and they were both part of Freemasons. They really differed and were at massive odds with one another. They didn't like one another at all. And part of that, actually, to be fair, was that MacGregor Mathers was this very disciplined, very staunch, what we would consider today a very conservative individual within the Freemasons. And Aleister Crowley was the exact opposite. He was extremely liberal. He would have sex with anybody or anything or anyone. He was constantly using opiates and heroin. He was constantly using multiple different psychoactive drugs and informing his magical practices based on those things. And so eventually there became a split where outside of the Great Pyramid, he allegedly channeled Liber alve legis, or the Book of the Law, which gave birth to the Thelemic orders. Today, Thelema, the law of Thelema is do what thou will, shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. And pretty much all of the tenets of it are written, channeled by Aleister Crowley, of a being who identifies herself as Nuit, which is like the Egyptian goddess of night, and the cloaked, the veiled stars. And it's all about enacting your will. And so Liber alve legis, or the Book of the Law, is kind of like the cornerstone of that entire practice. And so that's where the Ecclesiastica Gnostica Catholica, or the EGC, had its starts. That's also where Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, had its starts. And for a while, I was both a free and open student of the OTO, as well as a free and open student of our local Freemasonry lodge here in Utah. In Clearfield, Utah was where I was positioned at that time. And I had rights to come and go to just about anything within the first degree. They call it within the OTO the 0 degree, and you're just a free and open member of the Freemasons. And so you can go to various things and see the first level initiations and things like that, but you can't actually participate in them. You're just an open guest to be able to view them and see them. Just as long as you agree not to talk about any of the particular specifics. And of course, I've broken that that agreement many times, because I think that they're very, very fascinating. And there's many other people, even within the higher degrees and higher echelons, like Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight, who have talked very, very openly about what was happening within Freemasonry. And growing up here in Utah, seeing an offshoot, major religion being a major offshoot of Freemasonic thought and teachings and rituals, i.e. the LDS Church or the Mormon Church, it was very, very eye-opening and very relevant for me to be able to talk about and to discuss through the lens of comparison and contrast, the ways that they still operate and what they believed initially, and how that got changed by Brigham Young as opposed to Joseph Smith in the founding of the religion. Because, you know, Mormonism, actually, when it was founded, I can't blame most people for becoming Mormon. I mean, the concepts of polygamy were kind of odd and strange, but I can understand where they were coming from. It was mostly, though, pulling like rune stones out of hats and performing divination and doing some very magical based things and having very magical experiences that were highly mystical and connected you with the divine in a very existential and personal way. Whereas by the time Brigham Young arrived in Utah and, you know, said this is the place and established the religion, it became much more conservative, and they started, you know, cracking down on more things. And it became much more about enforced polygamy. And, you know, not to say that Joseph Smith wasn't perverted in his own, like marrying 13-year-old girls, but that was also just actually a tradition of the time. Historically speaking, girls were married as early as 9 all throughout Europe. You know, as terrible and disgusting as that seems to me personally, as well as within our current worldview, by and large, yeah, that's actually just kind of the way that things happen. And it was considered that if you were, you know, 14, 15, and you didn't have a suitor who was in his 30s to be able to provide for you and take care of you and all these other things, you weren't really doing so well, and you probably weren't going to go anywhere in life and have successful children and things like that. And even today, we know that most women are actually far more mentally mature than kids or men who are their same age. You know, a 15-year-old boy is still all about, especially today, smoking pot, skateboarding, you know, playing video games, doing whatever. And girls are more like, I want to go to school, I want to do this, I want to have these kids, I want to blah, 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 blah. And they've planned more. It's just a different mental maturity level, actually, in a lot of ways. And so myself now being in my 30s as a male and already having gone through a divorce because I was in my 20s and actually not nearly as mature as what my partner was, who's only just, you know, 4 or 5 years older than me, and seeing the wedges of division that were driven, it's like, culturally, I have somewhat of an existential and personal understanding of where things could have been coming from in those ages. But all of that aside, yeah, the Mormon faith is just absolutely bizarre, and that's also a secret order, so to speak, an esoteric order all of its own, that is also within the Christian vein. But the ones that typically Freemasonry in the West is also of a Christian vein, but they don't declare that you actually have to be a Christian in order to join. You just have to believe in a supreme power or a God of some form. So you could be, Jewish, you could also be Hindu, you could be any of these things, but what you get issued as a Freemason is a King James version of the Bible, Masonic Bible these days, and that's actually what you get sworn in on in most cases, though there are some lodges that will also use a Quran or other things like that. So yeah, very, very vast in their beliefs, but they all go back to Hermetic principles and what a Hermetic principle is. And this is what my whole principle of alchemiculture is as well, is being able to weave Hermetic principles into our social fabric. And in times that were bygone, being able to do that was not always apropos. Today, we're at a point where I can introduce these principles, and anybody except for fundamentalists will actually say, well, hell, that sounds really reasonable. Why don't we do these things? It's like, yeah, coming from my same perspective now, is like, well, why aren't we doing these things? Whereas in the past, various different pervading cults, and when I say cult, I mean that like the cult of Dionysus, the cult of Zeus, the cult of Aphrodite. They were different sub-factions of predominant polytheistic religions. Each one of the cults had like different ways of looking at things in such a way that you kind of had to form your own group, and that was like that. And then by the time Christianity came around and started to become enforced, talking about other gods really was relinquished only to scholasticism and wasn't really very apropos anymore. And so to be able to discuss these ideas in any sort of safety, or to be able to enact the ideas, rituals, and concepts of these things, you had to be able to perform them in a sense of a group of safety where other people aren't going to talk about it. Otherwise, it would bring about, like I said, very serious persecution from grander society. And this is where things became secret societies, as we refer to them today. And so it's not that they became secret because they had sinister intentions, although, as you mentioned, some people certainly have. And there are orders within orders, like I talked about, and people within a particular, secret society or esoteric group could have formed a more secret thing where things like adrenochrome rituals or other forms of Babylonian sex magic, or slave magic, etc., were also practiced, even though they may have belonged to the Freemasons or belonged to the OTO or belonged to Rosicrucians. They also had this other aspect to themselves that was being practiced among other people who had similarities like that. And, realistically, magic attracts a very particular group of people who are interested in all sorts of things related to what is unknown. And experimentation is one of those things that you have to have some sort of experience with something in a certain regard to be able to speak authoritatively or definitively about it. And if old text said, hey, if you do this and this is the result, in some ways you have to do the math in order to understand whether that's true or not, or you have to know other people who have done that math and model either your experience or your perception based on them. For me, I see people who do things that are referred to as like dark magic, and I look at their lives and it's just in shambles. Like they live largely in trailer parks and in like very marginal houses and places that are not conducive to the place where I would want to be personally. They, are constantly obsessed with tenets of revenge or hurting other people or deriving their power from other people's suffering. And those are not tenets or principles that I am interested in any way, shape, or form. So I can take a look at their lives and model my own practice off of what are they doing and where are they at? Is that where I want to go? No, that's not. So don't go down that path, kind of thing. And then I don't have to have the existential experience to tell me and inform me that's not for me. It's like you see somebody smoking meth and you see where they're going after 15 years or 10 years of doing it. You're like, I'm not interested,
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't always have to smoke meth in order to be like, don't knock it till you try it kind of mentality. It's like, nah, I can see that that's not where I want to go. So
now I have a few questions. So a frater, because I hear this term, the frater Albertus, obviously, and then I think within some other orders that's a common. What is a frater exactly?
Yeah, frater, or as it's pronounced in English, of course, in Latin is technically called a frater, and frater just means brother. And so it's somebody that is also a co-initiate with you. And if you're in a co-ed fraternity, which I guess in a fraternity you have fraters, okay, frateri. In a sorority you have sorors, sisters. And in co-ed things like the Rosicrucians, you have both frater and soror, and it just means sister or brother. And like even the Mormons use that term today when they're talking about it's brother Christiansen or sister Christiansen. Like it's like that whole concept.
And then so there's Grandmaster General, and then there's Imperator. What is kind of like the hierarchy, and what do those mean? Because within Rosicrucianism, doing some research, I came across different Master Generals, and then an Imperator.
Yeah, the Imperator is like it would be basically like the emperor of the entire group, and then Grandmaster Generals are going to be typically over a particular temple or a particular region. So like, for instance, it would be the same structure almost, or likened to the same structure as the Vatican. You have the Pope, which is like the Holy Father of all of them, and then you have like the archbishops of various regions, and then under the archbishop are various bishops, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of the way that it works within most of the secret societies, or fraternal societies, esoteric orders as well.
Have you ever heard of Maria L. the Illustrious within the Rosicrucianism? I guess he was the supreme master of the Rosicrucis order of the world. And yeah, it's linked to, which I don't know if it's a actual person, or it was linked with Merlin, Moses, Muhammad, Abraham, Melchizedek. He was the head of the orders of the Nazarites. This was from a document I came across, so I just found it really fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, it was probably just weaved into the overall cosmology, but not necessarily an actual individual. It's just like within Freemasonry, Hiram Abif, who would have been like
builder of Solomon's Temple.
Yeah, exactly. The chief architect of Solomon's Temple, like that kind of thing. I would have to do more research on that particular term in order to find out what that means. I've dabbled very strongly in Rosicrucianism and initiated myself into the true and invisible order, but being able to do that, you're a sole practitioner. I'm also very familiar, and I do have records of the first, I've got them actually in the library behind me, of the first male lessons that were sent to members of AMORC here in the United States, Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis. And I've performed those rituals. I've also performed the rituals of the BOTA, the Builders of the Aditum, put together by Dr. Paul Foster Case, who was very well-known, I don't know if I can use the term famous, but very well-known Rosicrucian himself. And so I'm very familiar with Rosicrucian teachings. I've got a copy of the Rosicrucian handbook, several of them actually from different years, up on the library shelves. And
yeah, I've always found out of all of the orders and different ones I've came across, the Rosicrucians that to be the most insightful and valuable in terms of the contents of information.
Yeah, me too. Like, if I could actually explain what my experience of Freemasonry is, it's older men performing mental masturbation about topics that they actually don't even really use, but spend most of their money buying stuff for to look like they're part of something, and then being younger guys engaging in multi-level marketing, selling everything to the other fratres inside of the organization. Well, not allowing women, but the women even have their own group, Daughters of Job. That's what they're known as. And it's Yeah, to me, it's basically reduced down to multi-level marketing disguised as hermetic, hermetic teachings these days, and a lot of mental masturbation.
So I wanted to share with you this kind of insane magical moment I experienced recently. Have you ever heard of a Melchizedek coincidence?
I'm not familiar of the term Melchizedek coincidence, but go ahead.
So I finished reading there's Eliphas Levy's Paradoxes of Science. I found it like phenomenal, and I'm sifting podcasts to see if anybody's covered them. And I found one. It was called "What Magic Is This?" It's a pretty good podcast. And so I listened to the episode, and then I move on, and I'm researching the Law of One for an upcoming podcast with mate Sosolu. So I'm learning about that. The video finishes, and then in the playlist of that channel, it goes to the next video, and the guy starts talking about Melchizedek, and there's something to Melchizedek, and so I go down the rabbit hole of mentions of him in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi scriptures and the Bible, and then I go on Instagram and I'm sifting through a profile of like random occult books, and one pops out to me that just looks interesting. It's by some frat or something, and so I type in the author and I'm looking into what else he's written about, and boom, he's talking about Melchizedek. And then here's the crazy part. So I go back to the podcast, the Magic podcast, and I don't know if I'm just looking for anything that looks interesting. They all look pretty interesting, and I pick one at complete random that I've never even heard the name, and they start talking about Melchizedek coincidences. And it kind of blew my mind, because it was just like this chain of events and it kept popping up, and I don't know what it means or whatever, but they were talking about Melchizedek coincidences, and that was like a coincidence within itself. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on like coincidences, and is there any explanation that you've come to with that?
Well, the way that I would describe a coincidence is actually that multiple people end up through various pathways stumbling upon the same experience or same information. So, or same archetype even within the astral. And so, within Hebrew cosmology, holding the Melchizedek priesthood is something that is really important, and pretty much all of the Judeo-Christian traditions all have a version of the Melchizedek priesthood, where you're able to perform blessings and other things like that. Melchizedek being one of the main priests of Hebrew Israelite culture. So, who is able to perform some pretty amazing feats at that. So, when you talk about a Melchizedek coincidence, it's like, well, the way that I would interpret that without even having any sort of context for it is like multiple people, multiple different pathways being able to stumble upon information of how a male individual in particular is able to stumble into his own magical power by drawing upon the symbolism and the archetype of a singular God form, particularly of like a universal God form. So yeah, that's what it would mean to me. And just coincidence in general, like I said, it's just like people who from different pathways end up stumbling upon the same archetype or arriving at the same answer from entirely different pathways or perspectives, and being like, whoa, what a trip. This is crazy. How did we arrive here? And there tends to be a proclivity, I suppose you could call it, for people surmising that there must be some universal truth to something if they arrive at a coincidence from multiple different perspectives. For me, what that means is that most likely is a principle and not necessarily something that's subjective. So subjective things would be like values and individual belief systems. A principle would be something that, regardless of your values, you can look at something and see it in a particular way that everybody else sees it from. And so it tends to be more objective. And that would be what I refer to as a principle. And so I think that when we stumble upon coincidences were starting to hit more principle-based things. Like, if you do this, then this happens. That's a principle. So it doesn't mean that the information that you stumbled upon is a principle. It means that the way that you went about it is in itself a principle that arrives at a destination. It's like a mathematical formula in a way.
Okay. And then kind of like, so like within the biblical context, we have King Solomon. I believe Ashley, one of her favorite is the Book of Proverbs. And then we have also Solomonic magic. Is that related in any way?
Is Solomonic magic and King Solomon related?
Does it derive from King Solomon? Is that?
I mean, yeah, it's said to be. King Solomon, so this goes back to the Templar, and the Templar orders originally were a group of specific Teutonic knights who defended the road and the actual temple in the Holy Land during the Crusades. And they were said to have excavated the actual temple of King Solomon, the initial one that was burnt down. But underneath, like I said, they excavated underneath that temple. What they found was what we would refer to today as a Venusian cult, actually, where God, or Yahweh, was the male aspect, but there was a female aspect, which we'd refer to as the goddess. And this is actually what the most inner sanctum priests were actually working with, because they knew that that was the source from which all new things were birthed. The seed of the creation came from the Father, and it was much less tricky, and people could birth far fewer evil things and just like not complicate the entire causal plane by bringing new things into creation. But if the inner sanctum, who were already typically what we would refer to as Kabbalistic rabbi, meaning that they were 40 years old or older, already had a family that they needed to take care of, were a rabbinical scholar, and also a rabbi to their community, and then they could become an inner priest of the goddess cult, where they would be able to use Kabbalistic trance techniques to be able to commune directly with the divine feminine. And in this way, they could birth new aspects of divinity into the causal plane and create new realities for the entirety of humanity. But that was such a secret, because if other people knew about that, they could actually clutter the causal plane, and thus the astral plane, and thus the physical plane, with all manner of shit, again, pardon my French, that ought not really exist, based on their lack of responsibility and understanding of everything that does exist. And so that was allegedly what the Templar had really found. And the Templar had amassed enormous wealth, even under the influence of the Pope at the time, popes, actually, multiple different crusades, multiple different popes. But eventually the Pope was able to create a royal decree at one point. In fact, you know, today's the 14th, yesterday was the 13th, Friday the 13th. On Friday the 13th of, I forget the year off the top of my head, I'd have to look it up. Under the French king, all of the Templar were rounded up and assassinated and killed, because the Pope had put out a decree that they had amassed too much wealth and were given a decree not to allow anybody else into their order. And they were among the richest people in Europe at the time, and the Pope decided, hey, if I usurp all of their wealth, now I become the absolute richest and we have no competition. And I'm sure there's more to it than that, but that's kind of more of the narrative that we receive today. So with that being said, Solomonic magic is allegedly part of what the Templar had drawn out of the temple and had released into the corpus hermeticum, or the body of hermetic knowledge that exists today. And it involves various magical practices, both you see the lesser keys of Solomon as well as the greater keys of Solomon, that show how to be able to utilize ritual in order to, quote unquote, impregnate the divine goddess with various ideas, philosophies, so on and so forth. And a lot of it deals with angelic magic and working, angels and clifothic forces all being within the realm of the causal plane, and being able to bring forth various things from the causal through the copulation of multiple different causal archetype. So that would be my narrative on Solomonic magic. realistically. But yes, it is said to come from King Solomon himself, of the Hebrew tradition.
So fascinating. Well, I have a couple more questions, but I want to see if Ashley has anything to ask, because I know this is kind of, you've been really generous with your time. Do you have any other questions you want to ask, Ashley?
I guess.
Any
Well, yeah, I have a couple. So I wonder, because we talk about magic a lot, and for me, I use the word miracles because, like, for instance, when we went through failed IVF, my daughter, she is she's like this little bright light of just, I mean, everything is perfect in her eyes. She's just not tainted at all. It's beautiful. But she kept going, Mommy, you're going to get pregnant and I'm going to pray for you. She prayed and prayed and prayed. And I went through a period where, I was praying on my knees, like you were talking about, routine and ritual, every morning, every night. And if I ever had someone I was angry with, I would actually pray for them to have peace, happiness, health, prosperity, and love. And it's amazing, yeah, because and one of my friends actually suggested that. She said, when you do that, she said, watch, each time that you pray, you'll feel less and less anger and resentment. And I'm going, there's no way. And at first I was going, I don't want to pray for this person. Yeah. But I started praying, and literally every single person on my list, this is so weird, within 2 weeks, something would happen where they would either reach out to me, or I'd be in a situation where I had to talk to them. My father was one of them, and he won't mind hearing this because he's an amazing person, very open. But we went through some rough stuff, and one of the times it was over, he had sold my grandma's cabin, and that was like a lot of memories. And oddly enough, we had this situation where we needed money to buy this land up north to do like a farm and stuff. I love animals. And I'm going, okay, I'm going to call him and ask him. And just somehow he said, yeah, absolutely. Never in my life had he really been there in that way, because I went through law school, had to do it myself and all that. And I just started crying overwhelmingly because, and I paid him back right away. But just knowing that he cared enough to want to be there, and I couldn't have any expectation with asking, and that's the hardest part. But it's things like that with, I think, praying for people that I am upset with. It heals you, because if you want something bad to happen to someone that you're upset with, it's like poison. I mean, It eats away. And I think you talked about that. So just curious if, for you, if you see a difference between miracles and magic, or if for you they're similar or the same thing,
Yeah, for me, magic is the science of achieving or accomplishing miracles. And in my own pathway, I deal very much so with the very same principles. Like, if there's somebody that has hurt me, my goal is to send healing power to them, to try and put myself in their shoes, see where the trauma came from, where the response came from, and gain compassion about it in such a way that I can visualize myself as them and see that thing healing within them. Not to impact me, because I can let that go. If people are mad with me, like, that's just a matter of me being compassionately detached and realizing that they've got their own thing that they're going through. But to be able to visualize them undergoing their own healing for their own beneficial satisfaction, and to try and inspire that change within inside of them. And if I notice myself getting out of hand in any particular way towards other people, doing that same thing for myself. Those types of things are among the most core of my practices. And then, beyond that, there's like, what I refer to as defensive magic, like, stopping people from sending you negative intentions and, different types of things like that could influence you as an individual. But even at that, the first step is create protection within yourself, whether that's calling upon angels, or, for me, that it has a lot to do with casting runes and doing bind rune work and, other types of mirroring rituals, binding rituals, things like that, to stop the negative effects. but then sending them good intentions. And that's a huge part of my practice too, is just like actually visualizing people who are sick that I see on the street, homeless people, individuals that are addicted to drugs and things like this, being able to see them in my mind's eye clearly and getting over their condition and sending that intention to them. And ultimately it becomes their ability to either decide whether they want that in their space or not. But the more people that hold that, the better off that they're going to be, because now they're supported in the healing that is possible for them, that exists as a potentiality within the astral field. So yeah, for me, like magic for me is very much so that it's just the science, the art even, and science of being able to accomplish a miracle.
Well said.
Love it. All right, so I wanted to ask you, where does your love or connection with Celtic things come from? You're kind of like a modern day druid. The history of druids is actually kind of a blind spot for me, although there's been some voice poking at me to look more into it. What might you be able to tell us about who the druids were and what their culture was like, and how it seems to be very instilled in you?
You know, the best I can explain this, and as fruity as it might sound maybe to other individuals, is that my recollection of this comes through what I would refer to as like past life recall, or like unsettled karma or unsettled dharma that needs to continue to play out. So ever since I was just a little kid, like it was the hardest, it still is. Like I was just telling my partner Nori, I have such a hard time watching movies that are set in our current paradigm or anything after about the 1700s. So hard for me. I just can't handle it, because I'm always looking and distracted at all of the technology, the vehicles, the industrialism and things like that. And it hurts my heart to actually see those things, not to mention to actually exist in a world where that's actually prevalent and they're even working on AI. Like I can't even tell you the psychological stress that causes me. But for me, everything that I have been dominated with is like medieval to Renaissance period. Ever since I was the littlest of little boys, I mean, since my very first recollection as like a 2 or 3 year old, was all about swords and all about riding horses and carriages and existing in the natural world and being out in the forest and communing with plants and animals and making potions. And like that's dominated my entire mental experiences as an individual on this planet. So I think that for me, a lot of it is just, you know, very innate and has always come to me. Like I said, when I was 8 years old and made the decision to be Catholic, at the same time, I was actually reading a Druidic text that was way above my level at the time by Douglas Monroe called The 21 Lessons of Merlin. And that was my first introduction to what we would refer to as Druidry. And even though that is part of what we'd call the 19th century occult Druidic revival period and had nothing necessarily to do with authentic historical Druidry, it was kind of a connection point that I would be able to make, and as close as I was able to get, especially as a freaking 8-year-old kid, to looking into those types of things and being able to practice them. And so getting myself a pilanten, being able to pronounce Welsh words, you know, properly, and being able to perform basic spellcraft and things like that within the Welsh tradition. All of these things were things that informed me from a very early age. Although I've always been profoundly Celtic, and it wasn't until many, many, many years after I started learning about, you know, Welsh Druidry and stuff that I became very aware of the fact that almost my entire family history on both sides of my family are what we would refer to as Hiberno-Norse and also Norse Gaelic. So Norse Gaelic is the term that's used for like the Danish people that settled in Orkney and in Scotland. That's what you would call Norse Gaelic. Hiberno means Irish and Norse means obviously Nordic. And so these would have been the Vikings that settled particularly in the Kingdom of Dublin in Ireland and so on and so forth. And going back to that, I have many different Irish kings, and even Ragnar himself is in my own line. And Odin gets traced back to the 260 ADs, according to the family lineage that we have. So within my own tradition, there's a certain bloodline thing that I think has carried through, with lessons that maybe I didn't learn fully, or things that I'm just so still enmeshed in, or that are relevant again as a current time period piece in our modern age, that it's time to bring this knowledge out of the past. And so for me, you know, even in college, I studied Celtic anthropology and was just completely enmeshed in it. And when we talk about the Celtic peoples, you know, up until about 15 to 20 years ago, it was considered that everybody from, you know, like almost Russia in Europe, all the way west through what we now could perceive as France and Portugal and Spain, things like that, they were all Celtic peoples, and they all spoke Celtic-based language and had similar culture. That concept is being dismantled, but that's the way that it was presented to me in a lot of these Celtic anthropology classes. And we learned about the megalithic structures of Europe and all these other things. And it's just always been so much a part of my craving to learn about and who I am as an individual, that I can't even really fully explain it rationally. So I just gave into it and said, you know what, I'm just going to go down this path. I'm just going to study all of the materials that exist. And in 2000, it's either 2007 or 2008, I met John Michael Greer, who is part of many different modern Druid orders. And he's just an absolutely fantastic, awesome character that is full of life and color and wisdom. And I mean, he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of all things magical. I mean, he's created modern translations. He worked with somebody else, I can't remember who it is, but he worked on modern translations of the Arabic Picatrix, which is like the astronomical magic of Greece and later the Arabs. And he's also worked on you know, tons of Druidic texts. I think he's written multiple different books on Druidry. Some of them I have, like the Celtic Golden Dawn material, and all of these other things. So I was able to meet him, and that was able to give me a really good, firm foundation in modern work. And just piecing together anthropologically and archaeologically from the best historical records that we have as well, which are very limited. The aspects from in and around Ireland, Scotland, even Wales and Breton and the Isle of Man, all of the different practices that we could surmise and the way that they thought. I've just always tried to put myself into those shoes and constantly re-explore those things and make that a part of my life. And so today, like you just did, people are like, yeah, you're basically like a modern day Druid. And it's like, yeah, I still got a long way to go, but you know, that's just my path, man. It's just like my own spiritual angle. Even when I was Catholic, I always proclaimed Irish Catholicism instead of Roman Catholicism, which is vastly different. Like in Irish Catholicism, you acknowledge that the good people, or the Fae, the She, are actual entities, that earth energies are constantly there, and that they're things that can be communed with and worked with. And sometimes they bring harm and sometimes they bring prosperity, and it really depends on your relationship with them. Do you give them offerings? You know, when you take a drink of whiskey, do you offer them a drink of whiskey? And so even today, every time that I have a little drink, I'm always offering the first sip of everything to the land spirits, both of my property as well as of hearth and home and things like this. And it's just been a major part of how I think and who I am since I was just a youngster. So yeah, I could go on, but that's pretty much it.
That's so interesting to hear you say that, because I, you know, Ancestry.com, I'm 75% Nordic, and then I have, I think, like 20% Irish. And when we bought this 38 acres of land, I'm an attorney, but my clients have no idea that this is like what I'm passionate about. I work as an attorney so I can afford my hobbies, which we bought a flour mill and corn. And, you know, people are like, are you guys losing your minds? I'm going, I love working the soil. I love taking a pickaxe and digging in the soil and building stuff. And when we go out to our land, you just look at miles of clear land and the sun and the flowers, and it just, ever since I was a little kid, I was always kind of the odd one out because I would go sit out in the grass and I would draw, you know, the flowers for hours. Yeah. And my mom goes, she's like, you never had to be entertained. You would just sit there, and I would sing to the animals.
Yeah.
And all this stuff, you know. So I always got in trouble in school because I was always daydreaming. And I would imagine that I was a princess in like the you know, Victorian era or Stone Age or something. And so my favorite piece of clothing that I own, I actually got from the Renaissance Festival. And it was this, you know, it's this full
my favorite as well.
Yeah, we, you know, if I could, to be honest, I would wear it every day. I'm like, I wish that we had a city where you could just walk around and live in that time period. I'm obsessed with it. So it's really interesting to hear that because of your bloodline and your background. And I'm wondering, you know, I have an important question for you. Do you like milk?
I like milk?
Yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm wild about milk, actually, and all things that come from cows, which is part of why I was like so obsessed with Hinduism early on. I was like, they also think cows are sacred. This is amazing. But, you know, later, many years later in college, I was like, oh man, this is crazy. Like the Celtic peoples were like, anytime that a Celtic tribe fought against another tribe, they called it a cattle raid because they would just go and steal the cattle and then get into these drunken brawls over it. Which I was like, yes, that somehow that feeds my soul just even thinking about it. But yeah, it's
meat
crazy thing.
And I'm happy.
Just to speak to the fact of like, God, I wish that we lived in a city that would allow us to do that. I mean, if I were to stand up right now, you would actually see that I'm in a 2-part druid robe. And I walk around like this all the time. I regularly wear cloaks and capes and Viking tunics and other things that honor my ancestry in a way that is relevant and personable to me. And people, you know, I've learned to give responses that are appropriate when people are like, wow, why are you all dressed up like that? Are you like...
Unless they don't have the nerve to do this.
And I just tell them, I was like, well, people call me the modern Renaissance man, and hand them the business card, right? But realistically, it's like, if I were to dress in clothing that is very modern, I feel more out of sorts, actually, than I do when I'm dressed the way that I'm dressed. And so over the years, I've stopped giving it what other people think, and I have just started doing my own thing. And it's very different from what other people are doing. And a big part of my learning journey is just learning to rock it. Just, you know, do what you're going to do, and look the way that you're going to look, and feel comfortable with who you are and express yourself as you are. And ironically, when I started to do that, that's when other people started taking me really seriously too. So I don't know if that was quote unquote coincidental and I stumbled upon some sort of principle there, or whether that was actually like a sign, like, you're in your own here, buddy, you know, like just stay here because people need a bit of this.
Love that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation. Where would you direct people to find you and learn more about your work and what you got going on?
Sure. Yeah, just my website, phoenixaurelius.org. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, places like that. I'm trying to be much less on Facebook, but Noriana takes care of certain posts. The same with Instagram. Like we have tons of content that we could be posting, but we just don't, like I mentioned at the beginning of this call, we don't really use our phones and try to limit our use of social media. It takes a very secondary, even tertiary or quaternary kind of force in our life. But we are on those places. So if you want to connect with us, feel free to do that. But our website and our newsletter list is hands down the best way to do that. We release a newsletter every month on or around the 5th. And we have, you know, all sorts of things going on. I do custom wellness investigations for people. I'm a scientific researcher that researches people's wellness today within the context of Spageric medicine to see if there's still any relevant basis of this. And then I publish my results each year from the studies that I've done and the work that I've been able to perform with clients. And I have an entire Spageric apothecary full of tremendous amounts of different herbal medicines that have been processed into various items of spageric pharmacopoeia, so that people who are interested or enthusiastic about my work have an outlet to be able to purchase some of these things of historical antiquity and be able to utilize them however they see fit, whether that's internally, externally, as incense, as medicine, as talismans, whatever. And I'm trying to think. I probably do a number of other things, but yeah, if you visit my website, you'll be able to see it all. PhoenixAurelius.org.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, both of you. Thank you so much. This has been one of my favorite conversations to date.
Likewise.